Hi, and welcome back to my channel. My name is RC Gray, and I'm a trauma-informed peak performance expert. And today, we're going to demystify this whole CPTSD thing. So, have you ever done stupid like put your keys in the freezer one night and then spend hours the next morning looking for them, making you late to work, and then you had to call an Uber? Oh, and then when you came home from work that day, you realized you had your pants on backwards the whole day and no one told you? And then the next day, you realized that you spaced out on a huge project you were supposed to do, so you called out of work, partly afraid of getting fired, and so that you could finish the project and try to redeem yourself in your boss's eyes. But instead, you stayed home shaming yourself and crying in the bathtub? Yeah, me too. I have had countless days and even weeks like this. In fact, I spent most of high school in detentions because of being late almost every single day. I was extremely emotional, and I would often just ugly cry over the simplest things. And I was labeled a moody teenager. I failed 9th grade English 3 times, despite being tested for learning disorders like ADHD, which can look a lot like CPTSD, especially to someone who is not trauma-informed. So let me know in the comments below if you would like me to do a video on the difference between ADHD and CPTSD, because it's kind of a big topic. So, despite the complete lack of trauma-informed care and being labeled as a moody I managed to graduate high school and get into college, where I spent the next 5 years in a cycle of overachieving and then crashing into near failure and burnout, shaming myself for being stupid and not understanding why everyone else seemed to get it, and I was absent the day they handed out the secret handbook to happiness. It always felt like I was working twice as hard but only getting half as far as my peers. I always felt left out and left behind. And go ahead and hit the thumbs up button if you can relate. This cycle continued into my career in architecture and environmental psychology. I was fired from nearly every job I had. I would excel briefly, and then another crisis would occur and it would derail my life. I would become forgetful, distant, flaky, unmotivated, and I would have a difficult time staying on task and completing my projects. My parents even nicknamed me Snowflake, which is when I learned that it is nearly impossible to outgrow someone else's perception of you, which actually only makes us feel more isolated and misunderstood. I finally became an entrepreneur because I knew I needed to work on my own terms, because some days it was really hard to get my together. Now, it wasn't until my late 30s that I finally understood what was really going on. After a year of living one crisis to the next, I finally hit rock bottom. I experienced a pretty epic trauma where I was kidnapped and I survived attempted murder. And if you're into true crime and all the gory details, you can watch a very long and detailed podcast interview I did on the SASS podcast with Dave Markell. I'll link it here, and I'll also put a link in the description below. So as you can imagine, that was the worst 4 days of my life. But honestly, the hardest part was the recovery process. I was determined to get my life together. And in my determination, I wanted to know why I always felt like damaged goods and why I felt like I was living in Freddy Krueger's version of Groundhog Day. Well, like any good story, the real problem starts way further back than you think. So being kidnapped and raped and almost murdered in my 30s wasn't my first trauma rodeo. I was sexually abused from around 4 years old until I was about 13. And I experienced victim blaming and shaming, and I was told to just get over it. And I never received any of the proper emotional or psychological resources to help me do so. It turns out that this long-term exposure to stress and lacking the resources to properly handle the situation caused my brain to develop in survival mode. This severely dysregulated my nervous system, causing health issues like ovarian cysts and PCOS when I was just a teen, and severe recurrent kidney infections throughout most of my life. However, this is also the reason why I spent most of my life labeled as a flake and feeling like something was always missing. Now, despite being intelligent, creative, and ambitious, I always felt like there was this veil over my eyes, and I could never really see the whole picture. Like there was this invisible barrier between me and achieving my dreams. When in fact, the whole time, I had complex post-traumatic stress, otherwise known as CPTSD. So what is CPTSD? Well, it's kind of like the cooler older sister of PTSD. While post-traumatic stress often comes from a single traumatic event, complex post-traumatic stress usually results from long-term, ongoing exposure to stressful events and traumas that often begin in childhood. And after long-term exposure to trauma, your brain's stress response system goes into overdrive. It's like having a hypersensitive smoke alarm in your brain constantly going off, trying to let you know that something is wrong. This alarm constantly going off in your brain puts a lot of stress on your nervous system, causing it to become dysregulated. And when our nervous systems are dysregulated, we often experience physical and emotional symptoms. You may experience chronic illness, phantom pains, or even autoimmune disease. And this is often where we experience mental health issues as well. Things like catastrophizing thoughts, internalizing shame and blame, struggling with feelings like we aren't good enough, like we don't belong, and even losing hope for the future and giving up on our dreams. The biggest mistake I see people make is trying to address the symptoms without addressing the underlying cause. Medications to soothe the pain and treat diseases, and therapy and more medication to cope with the mental health. Look, I get it. Sometimes you just need to get through the day, and therapy and meds can help you do that. However, if all we're doing is coping, it's like taking the batteries out of the smoke detector because you don't like the noise, but your house is still on fire. Okay, I do want to take a moment to clarify something. I do not refer to post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress as disorders. Now, while PTSD is listed in the DSM-5 and a recognized diagnosable disorder, I have all kinds of beef with the psychological field on this. I do not consider complex post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress actually disorders. They are not a malfunction of the brain. In fact, they're the opposite. This is your brain doing its job to keep you safe. And it's doing so with all of the information and resources it has. So let's talk about the brain. Essentially, your brain has 3 rules to follow. Rule number 1, no dying. It's your brain's first job to keep you safe. Rule number 2 is no crying. Your brain's second job is to help you regulate your emotions and, well, be happy. And rule number 3 is no dying, because if you aren't growing, you're dying. And this is where your brain helps you learn new things, reach your goals, and also where it helps you stay focused and think clearly. When you have had long-term exposure to trauma, your brain has been programmed to use all of its available resources to fuel the survival part of your brain, which borrows these resources from the thinking and feeling parts of your brain, which is why even smart people do dumb things when they are under extreme amounts of stress, and why we can often lose the ability to control our emotions, and why we are often forgetful or have very few memories of the past. It's not about intelligence, it's about how your brain responds to stress. So putting my keys in the freezer and not being able to get my together most of my life had nothing to do with how smart I was, and everything to do with how my brain was programmed to utilize its resources. Now, the good news is you're not stuck like this. By shifting your focus to regulating your nervous system will help you balance your brain's resources and put you back in control. And the really cool part about our brain is something called neuroplasticity. This is your brain's ability to adapt. With the proper resources, you can retrain your brain and your nervous system to remain balanced and even tap into what I call your superpowers and unleash something called post-traumatic growth. Have you ever heard the saying, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger? Well, that's only true if we learn how to use these added strengths that trauma has given us. And we can only do that if we get out of survival mode first by putting out the fire and shutting off the smoke alarm. It's been 5 years since I survived what I call almost murder, and I started my healing journey. And understanding complex post-traumatic stress, and most importantly, the brain and the nervous system's role in what I was feeling and experiencing, made all the difference to where I am today. Now, I am a trauma-informed peak performance expert, and I specialize in applied neuroscience for post-traumatic growth, which is really just a fancy way of saying I help people go from crisis to crushing it. I wanted to share this with you because I want you to know that you're not stupid. You're just stuck in survival mode. And if you're struggling to get your together and you're tired of living one crisis to the next, look, I get you, and I've got you. There is a link in the description where you can set up a free support call with me. We can talk about what you're experiencing, and we can create a plan for you to finally break free and show this world what you're made of. And if you want more touchy-feely super science, subscribe and share this with others to help them better understand what you might be experiencing. Thanks for watching, and check out these other videos over here that'll help you go from crisis to crushing it.